So the usual disclaimer to start, Collision did send me this pedal. They didn't pay me anything. They have no say over what I say. Let's get into it. So the name of the game here is sample rate reduction, and it does some really interesting things with that. It does a lot of other stuff, but it all kind of like intertwines with the sample rate reduction. So I'm going to make some sounds and then we'll talk about sort of all the stuff this pedal can do. Okay, so what is sample rate reduction? This is a purely digital pedal. Sample rate reduction is a purely digital thing. It has to do with how the sound is recorded in a digital format and how often there's a little dot, a little tick marking where the waveform is temporally from left to right. And so sample rate reduction reduces the number of those little ticks, so the sound essentially sort of reduces in quality. And so this pedal does a bunch of interesting stuff with it. And I'd say at this point, it's one of my favorites. There are others that do it in different ways. There are stereo versions of this. This is a mono pedal. There are things like the original Mood pedal, which did it with a more basic chipset. But let's dive first into how each section works. We'll start with the reverb. It's a very nice sounding reverb. I'm going to slow my sequencer down. We've got diffusion, which sort of correlates to both length and the amount of upper harmonics in the sound. And then you can filter some things out as well. Okay, next up we're going to dive into the next section. You can see this is kind of color-coded. The white ones are the reverb section, the gray ones are the second section. That's sort of a combo of sample rate and delay. I'm just going to call it the sample rate section. And then we have the orange ones, which we'll get to in a minute. But to start, I'm actually going to kill the dry signal by holding this button. There we go. And now I'm going to bring it back in here, but it's passing through this gray section. And you have an option here between the dry signal and the delayed signal. We're going to start with the dry signal because it's not really a dry signal because you're going to be able to affect it via this sample rate. I'm going to make those a little longer, a little faster, and a little brighter. Okay, so I'm going to do this slowly. So at just the beginning level, you can start to hear that overtone come in that sample rate tends to bring in, which I kind of love. That noisiness right at the top of the spectrum. My EQ says that is at about 11 or 12K. So you want to have good speakers to actually hear this. Now it's moving down to about 9K. Now I'm sure you can all hear it. We're down into, I don't know, 5 or 6K. And the farther we go, everything gets more reduced, and also that overtone becomes really super clear and quite a bit lower. And then at this point, it's pretty much destroying the sound. And back up. So all of that's really nice, and it can be done on a delay instead, and you can mix how much dry versus delay. We're going to go 100% delay for a moment. Time like that. Feedback, I'll keep the feedback low. I'll bring the dry back in. So you can really hear those overtones. It does, to my ear, feel pretty digital, but in a good way. It's kind of video gamey. Okay, we're gonna go back to dry signal. And I'll keep it just a little bit reduced here. So next up, the clock knob up here at the top. And this is kind of the most important knob on the whole device. It sort of impacts everything. And so what it's doing, it's setting the clock rate of the internal computer, and it impacts everything simultaneously. It's sort of like, feels like an effect that's at the end of the chain, but I'll let you hear first. Let's play a little bit of this. Okay, so you can hear just a little bit of sample rate reduction happening from here. Now, I'll slow the clock. So as you can hear, it's especially nice, especially interesting down low. It's very eager to get noisy. But if we lower the sample rate a bit, this has a much bigger impact. Now things can get especially crazy. Yeah, that's great. Now I'll make it a delay again. Same thing. Next up, that also impacts the reverb, which is one of my favorite things here. So let's get this going. That is super cool. You can do sort of similar things to this with the Mood 2 pedal, but not quite exactly like this. It has a slightly different vibe. Okay, and then finally you have the sequencer over here, which I find to be the least useful aspect of this pedal. I think some people will really dig it, but it's just not quite for me. But I'm going to play you some of that. So I'll speed this up a bit. Get a little bit of reverb happening. And then I'm going to start it. So what it's essentially doing is sequencing the speed of the clock. And it lets you choose the musical interval. Major second, minor second, blah blah blah. I'm going to try to put it on a fifth there. And then it gives you different shapes. Sort of like LFO shapes. Or maybe arpeggiator shapes would be an easier way to think of it. And that's going pretty fast. I'll slow it down. So you can definitely get into really interesting sound designy options here. It gets very video gamey at this point. I think due in part to the fact that these are so stepped, these sequencer shapes. You can definitely lean into the noise with it. So this section, like I said, isn't as much my thing. You can get some really interesting sound designy stuff out of it, but in terms of like creating pitch shifted ideas, since these are marked as intervals, I find that it's not that useful. If you're going to move things in more than one step, you're only moving it by the same interval, which kind of leaves tonality pretty quickly if you're doing anything other than a fifth or maybe a major second a few steps, which is totally fine. And if the idea was that it was going to be fully experimental, fully sound design oriented, why lock it to intervals at all? And why not just let it be, a smooth choice of distances? I think that would have been a little more interesting. So what we have here is essentially like a sample rate reduction playground. You have the one sample rate reduction sort of at the input stage there, and then the clock, which is doing kind of a similar thing, but later in the process, sort of at the end of the process. At least that's how it ends up feeling. So you end up with all these interesting sound design directions you can take between the interaction of those two, and then combining them with the time-based effects. Where this can get just like out of this world from just about anything you put into it really easily, which I like, because you can go, into insanity, but also you can sort of find places that are still related to what you're putting in there. You can still hear the pitches there, but it's just really interesting. And with digital effects like this, I find myself oftentimes, so I would record this into a DAW and then oftentimes bounce it out into an analog source. For me, that's usually tape. That could be a distortion pedal, I don't know. Something that just sort of doesn't necessarily take the digital shine away, but just what's the word? Takes out some of the harshness. I feel like giving it just a little bit of that subtle randomness on tape after the fact can make an effect like this just really sing beautifully. All right, I'm gonna do a little more playing. Thanks for watching the video. Hit those buttons. I'll see you next time.